My name is Madeline Rhodes, and a year ago, I stood in my studio in Manhattan holding the phone that would break my heart for the last time. My father's voice was calm, almost proud, when he said, "Your brother's graduation is that weekend. We can't make it, you understand." My mother added softly, "Don't make this a big deal, Maddie." I looked at the invitation to my first solo art exhibit, the one I had spent half my life working toward, and simply replied, "No problem." What they didn't know was that the event they dismissed wasn't just another gallery show. It was the opening night inside my own $12 million penthouse, the one they'd never even heard of. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because this story will remind you that silence isn't weakness, it's the beginning of power. I grew up beneath the slow hum of Charleston cicadas, in a white-painted house where magnolia blossoms fell like confetti on the porch every spring. My father was the kind of man whose presence filled a room even when he didn't speak, a respected doctor, deliberate, proud, a believer in things that could be measured. Blood pressure, test scores, salaries. My mother taught piano to neighborhood kids in the front room, her voice always soft, her hands always careful, as if she was forever apologizing for taking up space. Then there was Liam, my brother, the golden boy, the pride of every family gathering. His trophies gleamed on the living room shelf like small suns, each one reflecting my invisibility a little brighter. I was the quiet one, always drawing on napkins, on my shoes, once on the kitchen wall when I was 7. My father had stared at the doodles like they were stains, not stories. "You can't live off daydreams," he'd said once, folding his newspaper. "Pick something practical." Practical. That word became the family gospel. Liam was practical. Medicine was practical. I was a hobby. The memory that still presses hardest happened when I was 15. We were having dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, the clink of silverware sharp against the silence. I had just won first place in a regional art competition. My painting, a watercolor of an empty chair under a single light, had been displayed downtown. I waited for the right moment, hoping the pride swelling in my chest might finally earn a place at that table. "They're giving me a scholarship," I said. "They said my work has emotion." My father didn't even look up from his plate. "Emotion doesn't pay the bills," he muttered, cutting into his food. My mother's fork paused midair, but she said nothing, just lowered her eyes and started eating again. The words didn't just land, they carved something out of me. I smiled, pretending not to care, but inside, a door quietly closed. After dinner, I took my sketchbook and slipped into the garage. The single bulb above my head flickered like it was struggling to stay alive, just like the part of me that still hoped they'd see me one day. I drew for hours, hands, faces, shadows, anything to make the silence less heavy. Sometimes, when I was too tired, I'd fall asleep at the small wooden workbench, my fingers stained with charcoal. That garage became my refuge, my confessional. The smell of paint thinner mixed with the salt air from the marshes outside. It was the only place I could breathe without performing. In that space, I wasn't the doctor's daughter or the prodigy's sister. I was just a girl with a pencil and a longing that no one cared to name. Every night, our family ate dinner at the same table, mahogany, polished, perfect, 4 chairs. But over time, I began to notice that one seat, my seat, might as well have been empty. They'd talk about Liam's grades, his college applications, his soccer goals. I'd nod, smile when expected, disappear when not. That chair became a symbol, a quiet witness to everything unspoken. I started sketching it over and over. A table set for 4, but one chair always slightly pulled back, waiting for someone who would never be invited to sit. That image would haunt me for years, even when I left Charleston behind. At the time, I didn't know it yet, but that empty chair was becoming my muse, my rebellion, my future masterpiece. Still, back then, it was just loneliness taking shape on paper. I remember one night, a storm broke over the coast. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled like something ancient and angry. My father was in his study, grading hospital charts. My mother was practicing Chopin. Liam was asleep, dreaming his golden boy dreams. I crept into the kitchen, turned off the lights, and sat at that table. I traced the wood grain with my fingertips, feeling the cold where my plate should have been. For the first time, I whispered to the empty space, "Maybe one day, someone will notice you. Or I'll pay." That night, I promised myself something not out loud, but deep in the quiet places of my heart. I would paint until the silence itself had to listen. I would make something so true that even people who'd forgotten my name would stop and feel it. Years later, that memory would come back to me, again and again, the flicker of that garage bulb, the echo of my father's voice, the untouched seat at the table. At the time, I thought I was surviving. But in truth, I was already creating the first brushstroke of a lifetime. At 18, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and left Charleston before dawn. The train to New York felt like a confession, metal wheels carving out the distance between who I was and who I might become. My father thought I'd enrolled in the economics program he'd strongly recommended, the one he said would guarantee a future. I let him believe it. Maybe it was easier that way. But the day I stepped off that train at Penn Station, surrounded by the restless hum of strangers, I knew I'd chosen a different kind of certainty. The kind you have to build from nothing. The city swallowed me whole. I rented a basement apartment in Brooklyn that smelled like rust and rain. The ceiling leaked whenever it stormed, and the radiator hissed through the night like an old man's lungs. I worked double shifts at a cafe near Union Square, serving lattes to people who never learned my name. At night, when the city softened, I'd carry my sketchpad to Central Park and draw faces: tourists, musicians, lonely joggers who didn't realize I was turning their fleeting expressions into something permanent. Those were lean years. I lived off tips and instant noodles, counting quarters to pay rent, sketching on napkins when I couldn't afford canvas. But strangely, I felt more alive than I ever had under that perfect Charleston roof. For the first time, every bruise, every hunger, every failure was mine. There was a freedom in that ownership, a raw honesty my old life had never allowed. One late afternoon, the park was quiet, the sky stretched thin and pink. I was sketching an older couple sitting by the fountain when I felt someone watching me. A woman, elegant, silver-haired, wearing a deep blue coat, stood a few steps away, eyes fixed on my drawing. She didn't interrupt. She simply observed, with a stillness that made me self-conscious. When I finally looked up, she smiled faintly. "Your lines tremble," she said, her voice low, cultured. "Not from lack of skill, from remembering." I blinked, unsure how to answer. "I just draw what I see." She shook her head gently. "No, you draw what you feel, that's rarer." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small card. "Eleanor Hastings, collector, Hastings Art Foundation. Show me your other work," she said. "If you have any." That night, I spread my drawings across the floor of my apartment, the portraits, the sketches of empty chairs, the fragmented reflections of a girl trying to exist. When Eleanor arrived the next day, she walked slowly among them, saying little. Her heels clicked softly against the cracked tile floor. Finally, she stopped in front of one, the same image I had drawn since I was 15, a dinner table with a single chair pulled slightly away. She crouched down, tracing the air above the paper with her fingers. "Your pain has rhythm," she murmured. The words caught me off guard. Pain has rhythm. No one had ever described it that way. My father had called it indulgence. My mother had called it immaturity. But this woman, this stranger, called it art. For a long moment, she just stood there, taking in the piece, then turned to me. "You've been unseen for too long," she said softly. "That's why your work hurts, but it's also why it sings." Her words cracked something open inside me. I had spent years hiding behind quiet smiles and polite nods, training myself not to want too much, not to take up space. And now, here was someone telling me that the very thing I had been taught to bury was the source of my strength. Eleanor invited me to assist her at the foundation twice a week sorting portfolios, organizing exhibitions. In exchange, she offered access to the studio space upstairs. It was nothing glamorous: peeling walls, paint, streaked floors, a single window facing the river. But to me, it was a cathedral. Every morning before work, I'd climb those creaky stairs and paint while the city yawned awake. Sometimes, Eleanor would stop by with coffee and watch quietly from the doorway, never interfering. "Don't rush the pain," she'd say. "It's teaching you form." Under her guidance, I began to understand that art wasn't about beauty, it was about truth. My sketches grew bolder, my colors darker, my silence heavier. I painted faces I remembered from Charleston: my mother's downcast eyes, my father's hands folded like verdicts, Liam's reflection gleaming on the trophies. But in the corner of every canvas, I left an empty chair. It was my signature, my confession. There were nights when exhaustion pressed down on me like a weight. My apron reeked of coffee grounds, my fingers blistered from washing dishes. I'd sit by the window of my basement room and watch the lights from the brownstones above flicker one by one. People up there had lives, families, dinners, warmth. Down here, I had paint under my nails and a heart full of unfinished promises. But for the first time, I didn't want to trade places. The loneliness no longer felt like punishment. It felt like proof that I was choosing differently. Months turned into years. My work at the foundation taught me how galleries breathed the politics, the money, the fragile egos hidden beneath sophistication. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to let my paintings speak in rooms where I wasn't yet invited. Slowly, my pieces began appearing in small shows. Critics used words like raw, vulnerable, and defiant. I didn't correct them. I just kept painting. Sometimes, when Eleanor caught me doubting myself, she'd rest a hand on my shoulder. "One day, Maddie," she'd say, "they'll see you. And when they do, don't shrink." I didn't fully believe her then, but I wanted to. Years later, I look back on that first meeting: the cold park bench, the nervous smile, the stranger in the blue coat, and realize that was the day my life quietly shifted on its axis. The day someone finally looked past the silence and said, "I see you." That was the beginning of everything. 6 years later, the girl sketching strangers in Central Park had become someone even she barely recognized. What began as a rented corner in a shared studio had grown into Rhodes' Atelier, a sunlit loft in Soho with tall windows, white brick walls, and the faint smell of turpentine woven into its air. The name came from my mother's maiden name, Rhodes, a quiet reclaiming of something I'd once been ashamed to carry. On the glass door downstairs, the gold letters gleamed softly each morning as the city stirred to life. I still remembered what hunger felt like, not just the physical kind, but the hunger to be seen, to prove that my existence meant more than a footnote in someone else's story. I painted through it all. Heartbreaks, winter colds, rent overdue, loneliness that hummed like a second heartbeat. By the time my first major show opened, I had already painted hundreds of versions of that same haunting image: a dining table, 4 chairs, one always empty. That series became The Quiet Table. At first, I thought no one would care. Who wants to stare at absence? But somehow, people did. They saw themselves in it: daughters, sons, lovers, anyone who had once felt like the ghost in their own home. The image spread online faster than I could understand. Blogs picked it up. Then art journals. Then CNN ran a segment. "The Voice of Invisible Daughters." The headline made me laugh at first. But when I saw the article, my face beside my painting, the caption quoting my words about silence and belonging, something shifted. The world had finally turned its head, and for once, it was toward me. In those years, the money began to come. My exhibitions sold out before they opened. Commissions from private collectors filled my inbox. With the earnings, I bought a penthouse in Manhattan, $12 million of glass and sky, perched high above the noise. When I first stepped into it, boxes still sealed, I stood by the window for hours, watching the Hudson shimmer under the evening light. The space was too big for one person, too quiet, but maybe that was fitting. I had built my life on quiet. I turned part of the penthouse into my studio. Mornings began with coffee and sunrise spilling through the windows, painting my canvases gold. I would play old piano pieces my mother used to practice, their notes echoing softly through the open rooms. It was strange how, even in success, I still carried echoes of the past. Every brushstroke felt like a conversation with the girl who used to paint in a dim garage, whispering, "We made it." But I didn't let the success harden me. I remembered what it felt like to be unseen, and I didn't want to become another gatekeeper. With Eleanor's encouragement, I started partnering with art foundations around the city. Together, we launched a free weekend program for underprivileged children kids who had the same spark I once had, but none of the chances. The first time I watched them paint colors spilling across paper, laughter bouncing off the walls, something in me healed a little. One girl, about 8 years old, tugged my sleeve and asked, "Do you really live up there?" She pointed toward the skyline, where my building stood like a shard of light. I smiled. "Yes," I said. "But only because I started down here." She nodded as if she understood more than she should have. The city began to recognize my name. Invitations arrived from galleries in Paris, Tokyo, Sao Paulo. My work appeared on magazine covers, and my calendar filled with interviews. Yet, no matter how loud the applause got, I couldn't forget how it once felt when my own family didn't clap at all. It was strange people I'd never met celebrated me, while the people who raised me didn't even know where I lived. Still, I didn't reach out. Part of me told myself it didn't matter. Another part whispered that maybe I was still waiting for them to see my name somewhere and realize what they'd missed. Eleanor often reminded me, "Fame is just another kind of silence, Maddie. It echoes, but it doesn't answer." She was right. I could fill rooms with my art, but the quiet after everyone left still felt familiar, like Charleston, like that dinner table. One evening, after a gallery event, I returned to my penthouse alone. The city glittered beneath me, each light a tiny pulse of life. I poured a glass of wine and walked through the empty space. The walls were lined with my paintings, each one a version of that same table, each one whispering its own story. I realized then that I had turned my loneliness into architecture. Every brushstroke, every brick, every glass pane, all of it built from the silence they gave me. But it wasn't bitterness that kept me going anymore. It was something gentler, steadier, the understanding that pain could be repurposed. That what once broke me could now build something that belonged entirely to me. Eleanor's health began to decline that year. She stopped visiting the studio as often, but she'd still call every Sunday morning. "You're building something that will outlive you," she told me once. "Just make sure it also outlives your hurt." Her words stayed with me. When I walked into Rhodes' atelier the next day, the students were already waiting, paint on their sleeves, stories in their eyes. Watching them reminded me of myself at that age, the quiet defiance, the hunger to be heard. I told them, "Don't paint what's beautiful. Paint what won't leave you alone." That afternoon, I added one more painting to the Quiet Table series, the first in years. This time, the empty chair wasn't pulled away. It was closer, almost touching the table's edge, as if ready to join again. I didn't realize then how prophetic that image would be, how soon I'd face the same silence that once shaped me. But for now, everything was still rising. The studio was thriving, the foundation expanding, and my name had become a synonym for resilience. For the first time, I wasn't chasing validation, I was creating space for others to be seen. Standing by the window that night, the city glowing below, I whispered to my reflection, "You did it." And for the first time, I almost believed it. The invitation had taken me hours to design. I wanted it to be perfect, minimal, elegant, printed on thick ivory stock with a faint emboss of my initials, Mr. At the bottom, in delicate serif font, it read, "Opening Night. The Quiet Table, a solo exhibition by Madeline Rhodes, Chelsea Gallery, Manhattan." I sealed each envelope with care, my hands steady, my heart less so. One was addressed to Dr. and Mrs. Rhodes, Charleston, South Carolina. For a long moment, I held it between my fingers before slipping it into the mail. It had been years since I'd spoken to them. There were polite texts on birthdays, the occasional forwarded article from Mom about Liam's amazing residency in Boston, but nothing real. Still, a part of me, the quiet, foolish part, thought maybe this would be different. Maybe they'd see my name, printed and framed, and think, that's our daughter. The call came 2 days later. Dad's voice was exactly as I remembered it. Calm, rational, distant. Your brother's graduation is that weekend, he said, as though reading from a calendar. We can't make it, you understand. For a second, I couldn't answer. I stared at the canvas in front of me, the one I'd been working on all morning, a table half-painted, a single chair waiting to be filled. My brush hovered in midair, dripping color. Of course, I finally said. I understand. There was a rustle on the other end. Mom's voice broke in, softer, hurried. Maybe next time, honey. We're so proud of both of you. Both of you. The phrase landed like a dull ache. I smiled into the silence. No problem, Dad. After the line went dead, I stood still for a long time, listening to the soft hum of the city beyond my windows. It was the same phrase I'd used years ago when they skipped my first student show. The same tone. The same lie. I set the phone down and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse. Below, Manhattan shimmered 1,000 golden constellations stitched into concrete. Somewhere out there, taxis honked, people laughed, music poured from open doors. The world was moving, alive. But up here, it was quiet. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, and for the first time in a long while, I let the tears come. They weren't loud or dramatic. They fell like a confession, silent and steady. I thought of Charleston, the house with its perfect dinners, the piano notes floating through the walls, the empty chair that never belonged to anyone. No matter how far I'd come, that silence still knew how to find me. The city lights blurred through my tears, turning into streaks of gold and blue. I wondered if they'd ever seen my name in the papers. The quiet table, a voice for invisible daughters. Did they skip over it, or did they pause just for a moment and recognize the ghost of the child they'd once ignored? I walked through the apartment, my footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. The walls were lined with paintings, all mine, and yet the space felt hollow. Success had filled every corner of my life except the one that mattered most. On the kitchen counter, a vase of white tulips leaned toward the window. Eleanor had sent them that morning, along with a note. Remember, light doesn't need an audience to shine. I read it again, over and over, until the words blurred. I sat down at the long dining table, the one I'd bought when I first moved in. It was large enough for 8, though it had never seated more than one. The irony wasn't lost on me. My life had become a gallery of symbols, tables, chairs, silence. The things I once painted to survive had now become my reality. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere downtown. I wiped my eyes, forcing a smile, the kind I'd learned to wear whenever the world disappointed me. I reached for my sketchbook and began to draw. The lines came easily, a woman at a window, city lights reflected in her tears, her back straight, her hands calm. The caption I scribbled beneath it read, "She learned to build peace from the noise she was never invited to join." That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and turned off all the lights except the one above my easel. The penthouse glowed softly, the city shimmering below. No one watching from outside would have guessed the worth of this space, $12 million of solitude disguised as luxury. I stood there, barefoot on the cold floor, and whispered into the empty room. No problem. The words bounced off the walls and came back smaller, lonelier. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the truth. I didn't need their applause anymore. But that didn't mean I didn't still wish for it. Tomorrow, the gallery lights would shine. Cameras would flash. Strangers would shake my hand and call me brilliant. Yet tonight, in this quiet penthouse high above the city, I was just Maddie again, the girl who painted her loneliness and called it art. The night of the opening arrived, dressed in gold. Outside the Chelsea Gallery, a soft drizzle kissed the pavement, and flashes from cameras painted the street in brief bursts of white. Through the tall glass windows, I could see the crowd forming: critics, collectors, familiar faces from the art world, and a few I'd only ever seen in glossy magazines. Inside, the air smelled faintly of champagne and linen. The walls glowed under the warm light, each painting framed and silent, waiting. I stood near the back for a moment, hidden behind a cluster of guests, watching them move from one piece to another. The murmur of conversation blended with the soft hum of the jazz quartet in the corner. I'd been to dozens of events like this before, but tonight was different. This wasn't a collective show, or a fundraiser, or a student gallery debut. This was mine. My name was everywhere, on the banners, on the catalogs, even on the step and repeat wall by the entrance. 6 years ago, I'd been sketching strangers in Central Park for $5 apiece. Now, CNN was here. I wore a simple black dress, long, understated, the kind that didn't need to compete with the art. A silver bracelet circled my wrist, a gift from Eleanor. "You don't need armor," she'd told me once. "Just presence." As the evening unfolded, I floated through the room like a quiet current. People stopped me every few feet: curators with practiced smiles, journalists with recorders half hidden in their palms, investors murmuring about future collaborations. I answered politely, but my mind was elsewhere. My eyes kept drifting toward the largest wall in the room, where a long velvet curtain concealed the final piece of the night. The quiet table, the one I had never shown publicly until now. At 8:30 sharp, the gallery lights dimmed. The crowd hushed instinctively, the way people do before something sacred. The curator, a kind man named Julian, took the microphone and gave a short introduction about a voice that challenges the silence of generational neglect. His words echoed faintly in the high-ceilinged space. When he called my name, I stepped forward, heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The curtain dropped. There it was. A long dining table rendered in oil and ash tones, bathed in golden light. Around it, 3 shadowed figures: father, mother, brother, their faces blurred, hands folded neatly on their laps. At the far end sat an empty chair, slightly turned outward, painted in striking detail. The seat was worn, the edges chipped, but it seemed alive, as if someone had just stood up and walked away. A collective inhale rippled through the room. Cameras flashed, murmurs rose, then fell into silence. I stepped to the microphone, my heart steady, my voice calm. "When I was a little girl," I began, "I used to sit at a table just like this. Every night, it looked full: plates, glasses, conversation, but there was always an empty space. Not because someone was missing, but because someone wasn't seen." I paused, letting the words find their place. Tonight, that empty chair is here again. But it's not waiting anymore, it's remembering. My gaze moved across the audience: strangers, friends, critics leaning forward, eyes glistening in the low light. "I was told once that art should never be personal," I continued. "That it should transcend you. But how do you transcend something that built you? Art isn't revenge. It's remembering who you were when no one else did." The words left my mouth like a quiet confession, yet they filled the room as if the walls themselves were listening. Behind me, the quiet table glowed under the spotlight. For a heartbeat, it wasn't just paint, it was history, it was forgiveness, it was every unsent letter I'd ever written to the people who had taught me silence. People began to cry, not loudly, but with the kind of tears that come from recognition. A woman near the front pressed a hand to her mouth. A man wiped his glasses. Even the cameras hesitated, unsure whether to capture or to respect. "I used to think I painted because I was lonely," I said, my voice softer now. "But maybe I was just trying to speak in a language my family never learned to hear." Tonight isn't about absence. It's about arrival, the moment when you stop waiting to be invited and build your own table instead. There was no applause at first, only stillness. The kind that doesn't ask for sound because it's already said everything it needs to. Then, slowly, hands began to come together, hesitant, then rising, then thunderous. The noise filled the gallery, a wave that broke over me. I smiled, not the practiced one I wore at other events, but something real, fragile, alive. Afterward, people surrounded me, their words tumbling over one another. Powerful, transcendent, unforgettable. But their voices felt far away. I kept my eyes on the painting, on that empty chair. For the first time in my life, it didn't look lonely. It looked ready. Later, when the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed to their afterglow, I stood alone before the piece. The room smelled faintly of roses from the floral arrangements, and the floor was scattered with empty champagne glasses. I thought of my parents somewhere hundreds of miles away, probably toasting Liam's degree. Maybe they'd hear about this show on the news, maybe they wouldn't, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had finally said the words I'd been carrying since I was 15, without anger, without begging, without permission. From somewhere behind me, Eleanor's voice broke the quiet. She'd come after all, frail but radiant, leaning on a cane. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave silence a name." I turned, tears threatening, and hugged her. She whispered against my shoulder, "They may never understand you, Maddie." But the world just did. That night, as the last guests drifted into the city, I walked out into the cool Manhattan air. The rain had stopped, and the street shimmered under the glow of streetlights. I looked up at the skyline, my skyline, and breathed. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. And somewhere, in the distance, I imagined that empty chair finally being pulled toward the table. The morning after the opening, New York woke up to my name. I didn't plan for it, not really, but some stories decide to tell themselves. When I stepped out of bed that day, the city below was already humming, and my phone was glowing with notifications like a pulse. CNN, the New York Times, Art Daily, even Forbes, all carrying the same headline. Artist donates entire $12 million Manhattan penthouse to fund art education. The article featured a photo from the night before, me standing before the quiet table, soft light catching the corner of my smile, eyes half shadowed, as if I still couldn't quite believe any of it was real. Someone had caught the exact moment I said, "Art isn't revenge. It's remembering who you were when no one else did." That image was everywhere, retweeted, reposted, reframed, and soon my inbox filled with messages from strangers across the world. "You made me feel seen." "I am." My parents said the same words to me. "Thank you for painting what I could never say." It was strange, the very silence that once drowned me had now turned into an echo, rippling across millions of screens. I scrolled through the headlines in disbelief. Time called it a landmark act of creative philanthropy. The Guardian wrote, "Madeline Rhodes redefines what it means to turn pain into purpose." That morning, my studio felt brighter. The walls seemed to breathe. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, journalists, foundation directors, even government officials asking for quotes. I ignored most of them and just stood by the window, barefoot, coffee in hand, looking down at the city that had once swallowed me whole. For the first time, it felt like the city was looking back. The decision to donate had been quiet and private. I'd finalized it a few weeks before the show, signing the legal papers with Eleanor by my side. The penthouse had always felt temporary, too perfect, too still, like a museum for someone I didn't entirely recognize. Now, it would become the foundation's new space for youth programs. Art classes, exhibitions, scholarships. It would belong to the children who still painted under flickering bulbs and leaking roofs, like I once did. By noon, the story was trending worldwide. News anchors repeated my name in polished tones, commentators debated whether art could heal generational wounds, and thousands of people tagged me with the hashtag number the quiet table. For the first time, the table wasn't empty, it was global. Eleanor called that afternoon, her voice warm with pride. "Well, my dear," she said, "now they can't unsee you." Her words hit something deep in my chest, a mix of laughter and tears. She was right. For years, invisibility had been my default, a quiet armor I wore to survive. Now, my work had turned that invisibility into a mirror, and people everywhere were seeing themselves reflected in it. Messages flooded in from people I hadn't heard from in years, classmates from Charleston, teachers who once said my art was too emotional, even acquaintances who used to scroll past my posts without a word. They all wanted to say something now. "I always knew you'd make it. So proud of you." And though I read them all, I didn't reply. I didn't need to. By evening, the foundation's website had crashed twice from donations. People wanted to contribute, to be part of something larger than themselves. That was the real beauty of it. The story wasn't about me anymore. It had become a movement. I sat on the floor of my now empty studio, the walls bare, the canvases packed for storage. The light filtering through the windows painted everything gold, as if the city itself had been brushed in mourning. For the first time, I felt an ease I couldn't name, not triumph, not relief, just quiet alignment. The kind you feel when the noise finally matches the rhythm inside your chest. I thought of my parents then, of Dad's voice saying, "You understand," and Mom's soft, "Maybe next time." I wondered if they'd seen the headlines, if they'd clicked on the articles, if they'd paused for just 1 second to think, "That's her." Maybe they were proud. Maybe they were silent. Maybe it was both. Later that night, when the sky turned indigo and the city lights came alive, I walked back to the gallery alone. The doors were locked, but through the glass, I could see the paintings still hanging there, the quiet table. It looked different now. Less like grief, more like legacy. I placed my palm against the cold glass and whispered, "You're not waiting anymore." Behind me, the street buzzed with energy, taxis, laughter, music, but I didn't move. For the first time, the world was wide awake to what I had created. And I realized something that made my chest ache and glow all at once. Recognition wasn't the victory, remembrance was. When I got home, the phone buzzed again, a text from Eleanor. "You built your own table, and now the world is sitting at it." That, I typed back. It finally feels full. The city outside my window shimmered like 1,000 open eyes. The noise, the lights, the movement, all of it pulsing with a single, quiet truth. After a lifetime of silence, the world had finally learned to listen. 2 days after the headlines, the calls began. It was late afternoon, the kind of soft gray light that makes the whole city look like it's holding its breath. I was sitting in the studio at Rhodes Atelier, sorting through sketches for the Foundation's first youth program, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Mom. For a moment, I just stared at it. My thumb hovered above the screen, my heart ticking slow and heavy. When I finally answered, the first thing I heard was silence, the fragile kind that comes before something breaks. "Maddie," she said at last, her voice trembling, the syllables uncertain, like she was learning my name all over again. "Was that really your penthouse? The one in the article?" I swallowed. "Yes, Mom, it was mine." She breathed out a shaky laugh, a sound halfway between disbelief and regret. I don't understand. How could we not have known? We saw the news on TV. Your father." She hesitated, her voice dropping. "He couldn't even speak." "Maybe you didn't ask," I said softly. "Maybe you never wanted to know." There was a long pause. I could hear the faint clink of dishes in the background, the same Charleston house, the same dinner hour. For a second, I could almost smell it. Lemon polish, roasted chicken, the sound of my childhood. "We're proud of you," she said finally, as if the words were being translated from another language. "You've done so well for yourself." Pride. The word hung between us like an apology that arrived too late. That night, a text came from Liam. "Why didn't you tell us?" I stared at his message for a long time. He was the golden boy, still orbiting the same sun that had once burned me away. I typed, erased, typed again. Finally, I sent back. I tried. You just weren't looking. An hour later, the phone rang again. Dad. His name filled the screen like a weight. When I picked up, there was no greeting, no warmth, just the sound of his measured breathing. You should have told us earlier, he said at last. His tone was calm, clinical, like he was diagnosing a symptom. We could have done something, helped you. Helped me? I almost laughed, but it came out as air. Dad, I called you the day I left Charleston. You said, don't do anything foolish. I sent you my first art feature, you never replied. I told Mom about my first gallery, she said she'd pass the message. What exactly would you have helped with? He didn't answer. Just a long silence, the kind that once used to make me shrink. But not this time. Finally, he said, you've become quite successful. Your mother and I are happy for you. Thank you, I said. And for a second, I almost meant it. But then he added, almost absently, it's a shame you didn't think to include us. Something inside me went still. Include you, I repeated. You mean, after you skipped my exhibit? After every time you made me feel like what I loved was embarrassing? I did include you, Dad. Every painting I ever made, you're in it. The silence, the coldness, the distance, it's all there. You were always part of it. He went quiet again. And for the first time, I realized the silence on his end wasn't power anymore, it was guilt. I did tell you, I whispered finally. You just never listened. I pause. The line clicked softly, him ending the call, as he always had. I stared at the dark screen until my reflection blurred. For the rest of the evening, the phone didn't stop buzzing. Cousins, old friends, people who hadn't said my name in years suddenly finding reasons to reconnect. I answered none of them. Instead, I turned off the lights and sat by the window. The city glittered beneath me, same as always. But tonight, it felt colder. The recognition, the applause, the articles, all of it suddenly seemed paper-thin against the sound of my father's voice. The world had finally seen me, yet, somehow, the people who mattered most still looked past me. In the glass, my reflection wavered between light and shadow. Behind it, Manhattan stretched endlessly, alive with 1,000 stories. Somewhere in that sprawl, families were sitting down for dinner, filling their tables with laughter. I thought of ours, the mahogany one back home, polished to perfection, with a single chair forever empty. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. For all my success, that space inside me, the one carved out long ago, was still there, untouched. I had painted over it, gilded it, turned it into art. But some parts of absence never fade. When I opened my eyes, the city was still burning gold, and I realized something painful but true. Being seen by the world doesn't always heal the wounds left by those who refuse to look. That night, I didn't paint, I didn't speak. I just watched the lights blink on and off in the distance, a million tiny echoes of everything I had ever wanted to hear. A week later, I did something no headline could have prepared me for. I invited them to dinner. The message was short and simple. Saturday, 7 p.m. My home. No explanations, no pressure. Just an invitation, something I had wanted from them all my life, and now, quietly, I was offering it back. That evening, the penthouse was different. The walls that had once echoed with solitude now flickered softly under candlelight. I set the table myself. No staff, no catering, no champagne towers. Just a white tablecloth, roasted chicken, a bottle of wine, and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven downstairs. The kind of dinner that could happen anywhere, in any home. At the center of the room hung the quiet table, illuminated by a single spotlight. The painting's familiar emptiness seemed softer tonight, less a wound, more a witness. They arrived just after 7. The elevator doors opened, and for a heartbeat, none of us spoke. My mother looked small against the glass and gold of the penthouse, her eyes darting between the walls, the view, the faint scent of rosemary in the air. My father stood beside her, hands tucked into his coat pockets, shoulders straighter than they needed to be. Liam followed a few steps behind, uncertain, older but still carrying the same easy confidence that had once made me invisible. "Welcome," I said quietly. For a long time, we just stood there, four people pretending not to be overwhelmed by the ghosts between them. Finally, Mom exhaled and smiled, faint but real. "It's beautiful, Maddie." "Thank you," I said. "Let's sit." We ate slowly, the conversation tentative at first, small talk about flights, about weather, about how Manhattan traffic hadn't changed. Liam complimented the food, Dad nodded politely. Every few seconds, someone's eyes flicked toward the painting. I let them. It hung there like a mirror that had waited years for this moment. Halfway through dinner, I set my fork down and looked at my father. "Do you know why I painted that?" I asked, tilting my head toward the quiet table. He hesitated. "Because of us." I nodded. "Because of us." Because there was always a seat that never felt filled. I spent years trying to paint what that silence felt like, the kind that follows you, even when you leave the room. Mom's lips trembled. "We didn't mean to make you feel that way." "I know," I said gently. "You just didn't notice that you did." The words didn't come out sharp. They came out like air finally leaving a sealed jar. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the painting. "I used to think art was weakness," he said quietly. "That it was something people did when they couldn't face the real world." I met his gaze. "It wasn't weakness," I said. "It was survival." Something in his expression shifted, a small, almost imperceptible fracture in the armor he'd worn all my life. Mom's tears came quietly, her hands trembling as she reached for mine across the table. "We just wanted you to be safe, Maddie," she whispered. "We didn't know safety could hurt too." Her hand was warm, fragile. I squeezed it gently. "I know, Mom. I know. Mom." Liam cleared his throat, his voice low. "You always had something none of us did. You felt everything." I used to think that was strange, but now I think it's brave. I smiled at him, a small, forgiving curve of the lips. We were all just doing what we were taught. The candles flickered, and for the first time, the silence that settled over us wasn't heavy. It was gentle, a kind of silence that asked for nothing, demanded nothing. Just space. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The city shimmered through the glass behind us, the Hudson stretching like a ribbon of light. Mom wandered toward the painting again, standing beneath it as if seeing it for the first time. "It's so sad," she murmured. "It used to be," I said, joining her side. "But tonight, it feels complete." She turned to me then, tears still glistening. "We missed so much of your life." I took a deep breath. "You were there for the parts you knew how to handle. I've learned to forgive you for the rest." Behind us, my father stood in silence. Then, slowly, he walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture, but one I hadn't felt since childhood. "You built something extraordinary," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry I couldn't see it sooner." I nodded, swallowing the ache rising in my throat. "It's okay, Dad. You see it now." The four of us stood there for a while, facing the painting together. The chair and the artwork no longer looked lonely. It looked like it had been waiting for this for us. Later, when they left, Mom hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you, Maddie." And this time, I didn't wonder if she meant it. I believed it. After the elevator doors closed, I stayed by the window, watching their car disappear into the Manhattan traffic. The apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. The air felt different, softer, cleaner. For the first time in years, the silence in that room wasn't an echo of pain, it was peace growing roots. I turned back to the quiet table. Its light seemed to shift with the night, golden, almost breathing. I whispered to it. We filled the seat. And for the first time, the silence answered back. 1 year later, the penthouse no longer belonged to me. It belonged to something larger, something that carried my name only as a whisper. The glass walls that had once held my solitude now shimmered with color and laughter. Where marble once met silence, there were easels, paint-splattered smocks, and the soft hum of children's voices. We called it the Quiet Table Foundation. Every week, a dozen kids from across the city, foster homes, shelters, public schools gathered here to paint. Some came shyly, their voices small and careful. Others arrived bursting with noise, the kind that came from never being listened to. I saw myself in all of them. The ones who stayed late, afraid to go home to emptiness. The ones who spoke too loudly, trying to be heard over the noise of the world. And the ones who barely spoke at all, who let their paintbrushes do the talking. At the end of each week, we hung one new painting on the wall, a ritual I started quietly, like lighting a candle. Each canvas told a story. A self-portrait, a memory, a dream. The walls had become a gallery of unseen lives finally finding shape. Some mornings, I'd walk in early, coffee in hand, and just stand there surrounded by all that color, all that light. The room breathed differently now. It was alive. People asked why I kept the name, The Quiet Table. They thought it sounded lonely, but it wasn't. It was a promise that here, every voice had a place, every story a chair. Eleanor visited on the opening day, leaning on her cane, her eyes soft but shining. She looked around the space, the laughter, the chaos, and smiled. "You turned your silence into a choir," she said. "That's the real masterpiece." I still kept the original painting, The Quiet Table, in the center of the main hall. But now, it was different. I had reworked it that year, not for the world, but for myself. The empty chair was gone. Every seat was filled, a father, a mother, a brother, and one more. A girl in the middle, her hands resting calmly on the table, her face turned toward the light. Sometimes, when the kids asked about it, I'd tell them, it's a story about finding your place even if you have to build the table yourself. In the evenings, after everyone left, I'd sit by the wide window overlooking the Hudson. The city stretched endlessly beyond, alive with its 1,000 tiny flickers. I'd watch the lights ripple across the water, the same view I once stared at through tears. But now, that reflection no longer felt like distance. It felt like belonging. Voiceover. You don't need their applause to finish your song. Just keep painting. There was peace in the rhythm of it, the way brushes clinked in jars, the way laughter echoed off the walls. Peace in knowing that the quiet that once haunted me had finally found purpose. Some nights, I'd take out the old sketchbook, the one from Charleston, with torn pages and charcoal fingerprints. On its first page was a sketch of an empty chair. I ran my fingers over it and smiled, not in sadness but gratitude. That drawing had started everything, the pain, the rebellion, the art, the healing. It was proof that something broken could still become beautiful. I didn't need recognition anymore. I didn't need noise. What I had now was better continuity. Before closing each class, I'd gather the students and ask them the same thing. What did you see today that no one else noticed? Their answers always made me pause. The shadow under a leaf. A cloud shaped like a heart. The way blue feels lonely next to black. Those little details reminded me that being seen isn't always about the world looking at you. Sometimes, it's about learning to look back. On our first anniversary, we held a small exhibition for the students. Parents, mentors, strangers, everyone came. The space glowed with their work, and their joy filled every corner. When the night ended and the lights dimmed, I stood beside the children, clapping for them, not for me. That was the difference now. I didn't need to prove anything. After everyone left, I lingered by the window, the candles flickering behind me. My reflection merged with the city lights outside, quiet, calm, whole. "Tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now?" I whispered softly, as if speaking to the world that had once felt so far away. Because someone out there still feels unseen, and I want you to know your light is still yours. I turned to face the painting one last time. The quiet table glowed in the low light, every seat full, Every hand joined. The once empty space was now alive with color, a symbol of what can grow when pain is given patience. The silence was still there, but it wasn't hollow anymore. It was steady, peaceful, like a breath held and finally released. And as I stood there, watching the river reflect the city's heartbeat, I realized something simple and true: I had never really wanted applause. I had only ever wanted quiet enough to hear my own soul speak. Now, it did.